The water was at Audrey's chin. Hurricane Ida's outer bands had turned Terrebonne Parish into a bathtub overnight, and the old cypress workshop at the back of her grandfather's property was going down fast. She had been trapped inside for 40 minutes, the door swollen shut from the storm surge, the single window boarded from the outside by Deputy Glenn Tatum that same morning when he'd come to serve the eviction notice. 19-year-old Audrey Crane had maybe 8 minutes before the water reached the low ceiling, and she ran out of air. Then her foot caught on something rigid beneath the surface. Something metal. Something that did not belong to the rotting floorboards she had walked across her entire childhood. What she pulled out of that dark water didn't just save her life, it ended her aunt's. To understand what finding that box meant, you need to understand what the last 3 months had looked like for Audrey. Her mother, Delia Crane, had died on a Tuesday in March, pancreatic cancer, the aggressive kind, the kind that doesn't negotiate. Delia had been 44 years old. She spent her final weeks in the back bedroom of the house she grew up in, the house her father, Harold, had built with his own hands on 12 acres outside Houma, Louisiana. Harold Crane was 71 years old, stubborn as cypress wood, and the kind of man who drove 30 miles to fix a neighbor's fence without being asked. He had taken care of Delia through every round of chemo, every bad night, every morning she couldn't keep water down. He held her hand when she passed. And then, 6 weeks after burying his daughter, Harold sat down in his workshop to fix a carburetor, and his heart simply stopped. That left Audrey alone in the house. She had no job lined up. She had deferred her acceptance to Nichols State to stay home and help care for her mother. She had $72 in a checking account and a 2009 Ford Ranger with a cracked radiator. What she did have was the house, 12 acres and a white clapboard farmhouse that Harold had owned free and clear, no mortgage, the deed sitting somewhere in his papers. She had assumed it would pass to her. Harold had told her it would. He had said so at Delia's kitchen table the night before Delia died, with Audrey sitting right there. She had not thought to ask if he'd written it down. Constance Hale arrived 9 days after Harold's funeral. Audrey had met her aunt exactly 4 times in her life. Constance was Harold's daughter from his first marriage. 20 years older than Delia, and the 2 half-sisters had not spoken in over a decade. Constance lived in Baton Rouge and worked as a real estate attorney, which, as Audrey would soon learn, meant she understood precisely how paper could be made to say whatever you needed it to say. Constance came to the door wearing linen slacks and carrying a manila envelope. She had the practiced warmth of someone accustomed to delivering bad news behind a pleasant expression. "Sweetheart," she said, "we need to talk about the estate." The will Constance produced was dated 14 months earlier. It was notarized. It left the Terrebonne Parish property and all associated assets to Constance Hale, with a modest cash bequest to Delia, who was of course already dead. Audrey was not mentioned. The document looked real. It had Harold's signature at the bottom, looping and large the way Harold always signed things. Audrey stared at it for a long time. "This isn't right," she said quietly. "I understand this is painful," Constance said. "Grief does strange things to our expectations, but your grandfather was quite clear about his wishes. He told me the house was mine. People say a lot of things, honey. What matters is what they put in writing." Constance gave her 30 days to vacate. Audrey spent those 30 days trying to fight it. She called 2 attorneys. The first told her that without a competing will, she had very little ground to stand on, and that contesting a notarized document was expensive and slow. The second said the same thing, then asked for a $3,500 retainer she didn't have. She filed a complaint with the parish clerk's office. She wrote a letter to the Louisiana State Bar. She drove to the local legal aid clinic on a Wednesday morning and sat in a plastic chair for 2 hours before being told they didn't handle estate disputes. She went through Harold's papers 3 times looking for anything: another will, a letter, a note on a napkin. She found his utility bills going back 11 years. his Korean War discharge papers, a birthday card Delia had made him in 2nd grade, with a crayon drawing of a dog on the front. She found no will. On the morning of day 30, a tropical storm that had been slowly organizing in the Gulf upgraded to a hurricane and turned toward the Louisiana coast. Mandatory evacuation orders went out for the lower parishes. Constance, safely 6 hours north in Baton Rouge, called to ask if Audrey had vacated yet. When Audrey said no, Constance said that was a shame, and that she had already spoken to Sheriff Broussard's office. Deputy Tatum arrived at 11 in the morning. He was apologetic about it, which somehow made it worse. He told Audrey she had to leave the main house immediately, and that he had been instructed to secure the structure ahead of the storm. Audrey stood in the front yard while he boarded the windows from outside, one by one, the hammer strikes echoing across the empty field. She asked if she could at least stay in the workshop to wait out the storm. He said he hadn't been told anything about the workshop. She took that as a yes. She hauled a sleeping bag, a flashlight, a box of crackers, and her phone into the old workshop at the back of the property, and pulled the door shut behind her. The wind had started picking up. Through the small window, the only one, set high on the north wall, she could see the sky going the color of a bruise over the tree line. At 4:15 in the afternoon, the storm surge came. It didn't arrive like a wave. It came like a tide that forgot to stop. Water seeped under the door first, thin and quick, spreading across the concrete floor in dark fingers. Then it was ankle deep. Then it was at her knees. She threw herself at the door and felt it give slightly but not open. The wood had swollen tight in its frame, the door pressing outward against water pressure she couldn't overcome. The window was too small and too high. Her phone showed one bar, then no bars, then a spinning wheel that would not resolve into a call. By the time the water reached her chest, she had stopped screaming. There was no one to hear her. She pressed her back against the north wall, tilted her chin up, and breathed. Her left foot kicked something hard beneath the surface. She thought it was a floorboard nail. She kicked it again. It was too smooth, too deliberate. She went under. With her eyes open in the murky water, she could see almost nothing, but she felt along the floor with both hands, tracing the outline of what her foot had found. It was an iron handle, recessed flush with the floor, set into a square frame she had never noticed in all the years she had played in this workshop as a child. She grabbed it with both hands and pulled. The hatch was heavy and hinged, and it came up with a groan she felt in her palms rather than heard. She surfaced for air, chest heaving, then reached back down into the dark cavity beneath the floor. Her fingers found a surface, waxed canvas, heavily wrapped, bound with cord. She got both arms under it and lifted. It was a box, a metal strongbox, military green, about the size of a large dictionary, sealed at the seam with what felt like rubber gasket material, old but intact. The water was at her neck. She got one foot up onto the work table bolted to the wall, then the other, climbing until she was crouched on its surface with her head pressed against the ceiling and maybe 4 inches of airspace remaining. She held the box against her chest like something living. The water stayed there for 2 hours, then it began slowly to drop. By 9 in the evening, the workshop floor was visible again. The door opened outward now, warped wide in its frame, swinging freely in 6 inches of standing water. Audrey stepped out into the dark and the drizzle with the box under her arm, her shoes sucking in the mud, and she walked. She walked the half-mile of flooded gravel to the highway. She flagged down a utility truck, a Clico crew vehicle, the driver a heavy-set man named Curtis with kind eyes who was working the outage restoration. He took one look at her and said, "Get in." He dropped her at a diner in grey that was running on a generator, light blazing through its plate glass windows into the wet dark, and she sat in a corner booth with a cup of coffee and the box on the seat beside her. She didn't open it right away. She sat with both hands around the mug and let the shaking in her arms slow down. She thought about Harold, about how he had spent 30 years working in that shop, about how he had built the hidden compartment, and she was certain now that he had built it deliberately, with intention, with a specific thing in mind to put inside it. She pressed the clasps. They popped open cleanly. Inside, triple-wrapped in waxed canvas and then sealed in a heavy Ziploc bag that had kept everything bone-dry, were 4 items. The first was a handwritten letter dated 11 months ago in Harold's unmistakable sloping cursive. The second was a manila envelope marked Last Will and Testament, Harold James Crane, notarized by a different notary than the one on Constance's document and dated 18 months ago, 4 months before the date on Constance's version. The third was a USB drive labeled in Harold's handwriting for Audrey. The fourth was a thin stack of bank statements with specific transactions circled in red pen, totaling. Audrey counted 3 times, just over $210,000 withdrawn from Harold's savings account over 2 years. All of it transferred to a bank in Baton Rouge. Audrey read the letter slowly. "If you're reading this, I didn't get a chance to tell you myself, and I'm sorry for that. I changed my will after your mother's diagnosis because I knew Constance would come around once I was gone. She's been borrowing from me for years and calling it her inheritance. I've got the records. The new will is in here along with everything you'll need. I hid this because I didn't trust putting it in my desk. She's been in the house twice without asking. The USB has recordings. I kept my phone on during her visits. I'm sorry I didn't handle it while I was here. I should have. This place is yours, Audrey. It has always been yours. Don't let her have it. Love, Grandpa." Audrey sat in that booth for a long time. The cook asked twice if she wanted anything else. She said no, then said yes, eggs and toast, and ate without tasting any of it. She looked up attorneys in Houma on the diner's Wi-Fi. She read reviews for 20 minutes. She almost called 3 different people before she found the name Theodore Marsh on a firm's website. A brief bio noted he had served 12 years as a Louisiana assistant state attorney before moving to private practice, specializing in estate fraud and civil litigation. The site had a photo of a trim man in his late 50s, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and an expression that suggested he had heard every possible version of every possible lie. She called the number. It went to voicemail. She left a message that lasted approximately 45 seconds and ended with the words elder financial abuse, forged will, and about $200,000 in stolen money. He called back in 12 minutes. At 8:30 the next morning, Audrey walked into the offices of Marsh & Associates on Main Street in Houma carrying the strongbox. Theodore Marsh, Ted, he said immediately, no formality, met her at the door himself, which she later understood was unusual. He brought her into a conference room, set a legal pad in front of him, and said, "Start from the beginning." She talked for 40 minutes. He interrupted only twice. When she finished, Ted picked up the manila envelope and examined the notarization. He read through the will slowly. He opened his laptop, pulled up the Louisiana Notary Registry, and cross-referenced the seal. Then he did the same with Constance's version. He looked up from the screen. The notary on your grandfather's will is licensed and current. The notary on your aunt's document is a Mary Ellen Guidry, license number 40187. He paused. Mary Ellen Guidry surrendered her notary commission 14 months ago after a complaint was filed against her. This document was notarized on a lapsed license. Audrey stared at him. That alone is sufficient to challenge its validity, Ted said, but combined with the earlier date on this will, he held up Harold's document, and the financial records you have, this is not a difficult case. He set his glasses on the table. What makes it urgent is timing. Do you know what your aunt's immediate plans are for the property? Audrey said she didn't know for certain. Ted turned his laptop around. On the screen was a public notice filed with the Terrebonne Parish Clerk of Court. A notice of imminent property transfer, the Crane property on Biou du Large Road, 12.4 acres and primary residential structure. Buyer, Pelican Coast Development Group. Consideration, $1.9 million. Filing date for final transfer documents, today, 11 a.m. at the parish courthouse. Audrey looked at the clock on the wall. It was 9:47. Constance scheduled this before the storm, Ted said, already standing. She wanted it done and sealed before you could find anything. He picked up his phone and called his paralegal. Fast instructions, certified copies of everything, file an emergency injunction with the parish clerk. They had 1 hour. He grabbed his briefcase. He looked at Audrey across the table with an expression she would not forget. "I've been practicing law in this state for 31 years, he said. I have been waiting my entire career to walk into a room with documentation this clean. He held the door open. Let's go. The Terrebonne Parish Courthouse was a low brick building on Roussel Street, and the conference room reserved for the Pelican Coast closing was off the main hall, glass-walled, visible from the corridor. Audrey could see the table through the glass as they walked. A developer's representative, 2 corporate attorneys in identical navy suits, a parish notary, and Constance, seated at the head of the table in cream-colored silk, a gold fountain pen in her hand, the transfer documents fanned out in front of her. Constance's eyes found Audrey through the glass before they reached the door. The color left her face. Ted Marsh opened the conference room door without knocking. "Mr. Fontenot," he said, addressing the lead developer's attorney directly, "my name is Theodore Marsh. I represent the estate of Harold James Crane and his sole legal heir, Audrey Crane." He set his briefcase on the table, clicked it open, and placed a certified copy of Harold's will in front of every person in the room. "Before anyone signs anything, you need to understand that the property transfer you are about to execute is predicated on a fraudulent will executed with a lapsed notarial commission and post-dated to supersede a valid instrument filed 18 months prior." The attorney on the left picked up the document. He read the first page. He read the second. His expression didn't change, but he stopped moving. "This is harassment," Constance said. Her voice was even and hard. "This child has no legal standing. The will has already been accepted by the court." "The will was accepted because no competing instrument had been submitted," Ted said. "We are submitting one now, along with a motion to vacate the prior acceptance and an emergency injunction against this transfer. I have already filed both with the parish clerk's office, as of," he checked his watch, 11 minutes ago. "She's been living in my father's house without permission for 3 months, Constance said, looking at the developers now, not at Ted. "She has been harassing me and making baseless accusations." "Constance." Audrey said her name quietly, without anger. She reached into her jacket pocket and set the USB drive on the table. "He recorded you." The silence in the room was complete. "He kept his phone in his front pocket during your visits," Audrey said. "He wrote me a letter explaining exactly what was on it." She looked at her aunt steadily. "He knew what you were doing to him. He was just too tired to fight you himself." Constance's hand, the one holding the gold pen, lowered slowly to the table. The lead developer's attorney leaned over and spoke quietly into his colleague's ear. The colleague nodded once. Both of them stood up. "Mr. Marsh," the lead attorney said, gathering his copies of the documents, "Pelican Coast Development will not be proceeding with this transfer today. We'll need to pause until title is clear." He glanced briefly at Constance. "We'll be in touch once the estate matter is resolved. Or we won't be." He nodded at his colleague, and they walked out together, their assistants filing out behind them. The parish notary packed her stamp into her bag and followed without a word. The room was left with Audrey, Ted, Constance, and the unsigned documents spread across the table like a hand of cards nobody had won. Constance looked at the papers for a long moment. Then she looked at Audrey, and whatever argument had been forming behind those careful, practiced eyes simply collapsed. She looked old. She looked like a woman who had spent 2 years constructing something and was watching it disassemble itself in the space of 15 minutes. "He wasn't going to give it to you," Constance said finally. Her voice was flat, stripped of its professional warmth. "He was going to give everything to you, and your mother and I was going to be left with nothing. Like always. Like my entire life." Audrey thought about Harold's letter, about the word borrowed and the word yours. She thought about her mother's last weeks in the back bedroom, about Harold sitting up through the night in the hallway chair because he couldn't bear to be too far away. That was his choice to make, she said. 2 weeks later, Constance Hale was charged with will fraud, forgery of a notarial instrument, and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, a felony under Louisiana Statute 1467-24. The Louisiana State Bar opened a disciplinary proceeding against her license. The $210,000 in transferred funds became the subject of a civil recovery action that Ted filed the same afternoon. The estate case was resolved in 3 months. Harold's will was recognized as valid. The property on Bayou du Large Road, all 12.4 acres, the main house and the cypress workshop with its hidden hatch, was transferred cleanly into Audrey's name. She stood in her grandfather's kitchen the morning after the title came through and did not move for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. The ceiling fan turned slow. Morning light came through the window above the sink, the way it had come through every morning of her childhood, gold and flat across the linoleum floor. She had eaten cereal at this counter, done homework at that table, learned to drive in the gravel driveway. She could see through the window. She was home. But she didn't stop there. By the following spring, she had converted the detached garage at the far edge of the property into the Harold Crane Legal Aid Clinic, a partnership with the Terrebonne Parish Public Library and 2 pro bono attorneys Ted helped recruit. The clinic offered free estate planning consultations and elder financial abuse resources, specifically for families in the rural parishes who didn't have a $3,500 retainer or 2 hours to drive into Baton Rouge. In its first 6 months, it helped 41 families. One of them was an elderly man in Montegut whose stepson had been quietly redirecting his pension checks for 2 years. Harold had hidden a box in the floor because he believed that truth, protected carefully enough, would outlast the people trying to bury it. He just needed someone to go looking. Audrey went looking. What would you have done, standing in that workshop with the water rising, if your foot had caught on something in the dark? Would you have reached down, or would you have been too focused on the door that wouldn't open? Sometimes the thing that saves you is the thing you almost didn't notice. Audrey noticed, and it changed everything. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Like it, subscribe to Keep the Drama, and leave a comment below. We read every single one. We'll see you next time.